Hello, curious minds. Let me ask you something. Does it seem normal to you that we can map Mars in incredible detail, but not the interior of Greenland? Everything turns into a blank white void. No mountains, no valleys, just ice, or something that isn't meant to be seen. Today, we're going to try to untangle this mystery. If you follow old world investigations, Tartaria maps that vanish, resets that reframe whole centuries, places quietly reclassified or renamed, then you already know the pattern. It's not always a smoking gun. It's often a silence, a blank space where details should exist. That's why Greenland matters. Okay, assume there's nothing strange here. Assume it's all just ice and boring logistics. Then explain 3 coincidences at once. First, why do older maps repeatedly show internal relief, mountain systems, and long channels, while modern public maps flatten the interior into a featureless void? Second, why does the technology to see beneath ice exist, yet the default civilian view still gives you almost nothing? No buried ridges, no subglacial valleys, no structure, just blank white. Third, why do multiple historical references talk like something changed recently? Previously navigable, settlements disappearing, routes becoming impossible. If the interior has been frozen and stable for 1,000,000 years. Separately, you can explain each point away. Together, they behave like a pattern. There's something deeply unsettling about the way Greenland is presented to us today, not in history books, not in official scientific summaries, but in the most basic tools we use to look at the planet. Open any modern map service. Zoom in more. And what should appear, mountains, valleys, faults, geological scars, simply doesn't. Greenland's interior becomes a flat, featureless white space, as if the terrain itself has been erased. And in this niche, erased is the word that always raises a second question. Erased by nature, or erased by narrative. And we're not talking about a small technical issue. We're talking about more than 70% of the largest island on Earth, an area larger than many countries combined, reduced visually to a surface with almost no public-facing detail. The official explanation is familiar. A gigantic ice sheet covers everything, ice so old it predates human history. So heavy, it didn't just scrape the ground, it pushed it downward. According to current models, Greenland's ice sheet began forming roughly 1,000,000 years ago. Studies based on isotopes like beryllium-10 and aluminum-26 suggest that before that period, Greenland may have been ice-free for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, the cold arrived. Ice advanced, and its weight supposedly pressed the central bedrock down towards sea level. Under that logic, if the ice vanished today, Greenland wouldn't rise as one solid island. It would appear more like a fragmented archipelago. It's an elegant explanation, almost too elegant, because it asks us to accept something extraordinary, that entire mountain systems weren't slowly worn down by erosion, but were literally pushed downward by the weight of ice. That whole ranges were compressed, not destroyed, but sunk, while leaving no visible trace in the modern public map view. That's the first crack. If the ice is that ancient, that stable, that massive, why don't older maps show Greenland like this? Because when we step back in time and look at the cartography of the 15th and 16th centuries, Greenland appears as something completely different. Not a permanent frozen desert, but a land with relief, with clearly drawn mountain systems, with valleys, rivers, and in some cases, even vegetation. A 1570 map attributed to Mercator shows a detailed Greenland with well-defined internal mountains. It isn't a vague sketch or a symbolic blob. It's coherent, similar in detail to what Mercator drew for other regions known in his time. If we accept the official chronology, Mercator was drawing a landscape that had supposedly vanished under ice hundreds of thousands of years before he was born. That's the kind of timeline mismatch reset theories live on. The map looks recent. The official age looks ancient. That raises an uncomfortable question. How could he depict something that, according to modern science, no human in recorded history could have seen? And it isn't just one map. Cartographers from different regions and periods show a Greenland that doesn't match the version we're taught today. A 1638 map indicates the island was snow-covered only part of the year, seasonal, like Scandinavia, not a perpetual deep freeze, not an impenetrable ice cap, just brutal winters and livable summers. And some maps go further. There are 17th century representations showing what look like channels or straits cutting across Greenland from east to west. Not simple coastline mistakes, but long, continuous internal passages, sometimes with explicit notes. Previously navigable, now closed by ice. That phrase is everything. Previously navigable, not a million years ago. Previously. If those passages ever existed, they imply a radically different interior, more accessible terrain, a climate mild enough to allow travel, exploration, and perhaps human activity deeper than anyone officially recognizes. The official story says Greenland has been inhabited for at least 4,500 years, mostly along the coasts. We know the Norse arrived in the 10th century. We know Eric the Red established colonies. We know Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland to North America centuries before Columbus. We also know those colonies disappear from the record by the late 15th century. The standard explanation blames economics, isolation, conflict, and gradual cooling, but it assumes Greenland's climate was essentially the same then as now. It assumes marginal conditions from the start, but what if it wasn't? What if Greenland was more temperate in the 14th and 15th centuries, and then the ice advanced quickly and aggressively over a relatively short period? Then the disappearance of the Norse settlements stops looking like a mystery. They wouldn't have abandoned a permanently hostile land. They would have fled a land that was becoming uninhabitable. This is where the blank interior on modern maps becomes unsettling. Because today, when we look at Greenland through civilian satellite views, we don't even see hints of the underlying relief. No shadows of mountains, no drainage lines, nothing. And that's strange in an era where ice-penetrating radar exists, where scientists have mapped structures under kilometers of Antarctic ice. The data exists, but it isn't shown to you by default. And whether you call that a design choice, a simplification, or a soft kind of censorship, the effect is the same. The interior stays mentally invisible. Meanwhile, Greenland's ice is melting faster. In recent heat waves, billions of tons of ice vanished in days. Studies report that the loss rate is now several times higher than it was in the early 2000s. Every summer exposes more of the edge. Every year reveals new rock, surfaces that haven't seen daylight in modern history. The question isn't whether the ice is melting. That's not in dispute. The question is, what will appear underneath? If the landscape matches the current models, the story stays intact. But if structures begin to emerge, odd alignments, unnatural channels, signs of human activity beyond the coasts, then the blank white stops being a technical curiosity and becomes a historical problem. Because it would imply Greenland wasn't always what we see today, and that recent history might be far less stable than we assume. If older maps showed mountains, internal waterways, even habitable zones, why is everything now a blank void? Did the ice erase the relief? Or was the relief erased so you wouldn't ask that question? What exactly is hidden under this visual silence? If the old maps were simply mistakes, the problem would be solved. We could say early cartographers worked from incomplete information, exaggerated stories, or imagination. But when you compare these maps side by side, the pattern isn't chaotic, it's coherent. And that's what makes it dangerous to the official timeline. Across more than 2 centuries, cartographers from different countries, languages, and traditions portrayed Greenland with similar internal features: marked relief, mountain systems, deep valleys, and in some cases, channels that cut through the island. They weren't exact copies of each other. That's one of the most revealing details. Some show a single east-west channel, others show 2. Some draw them farther north, others place them farther south. That isn't what happens when one person copies an error. That's what happens when multiple people record the same phenomenon from different sources or different moments. One of the most intriguing examples appears on a 1747 map showing a long channel cutting across Greenland almost coast to coast. The annotation says the passage was once navigable, but by that time had already been closed by ice. If that channel ever existed, its length would have been over 1,000 kilometers. Not a minor river, not a seasonal crack. A dominant geographical structure, impossible to ignore for anyone living near Greenland or navigating its coasts. And yet today, it appears on no modern public map. Another map, this one from 1592, made by Vincenzo Coronelli, shows southern Greenland without permanent ice cover. More provocatively, it shows 2 straits cutting through the landmass and even draws trees and vegetation, not Arctic moss, not lichens. The iconography used is recognizable, like the trees Coronelli drew in temperate regions. In 1763, an illustration attributed to Hans Egede depicts extensive green areas. Egede wasn't a random artist. He was a missionary and chronicler who spent years in Greenland. His descriptions speak of grassland, fauna, and conditions that don't fit the image of an island dominated by ice everywhere. Now, the narrative begins to strain. Academic explanations often argue these maps relied on incorrect assumptions, that places described in Icelandic sagas were located on Greenland's east coast, when in reality they were in the southwest. Under this view, cartographers filled unknown interiors with guesswork, drawing channels that didn't exist and mountains where there was only ice. But that explanation ignores something fundamental. The sagas do not describe a world of permanent ice. They describe arable land, pasture, travel routes, places with specific names, measurable distances, and consistent geographical references. The problem isn't that those places don't appear on modern maps. The problem is that they cannot exist in a Greenland that has been buried under a million-year ice sheet. The tension increases in the 19th century. In 1888, Fridtjof Nansen organized the first successful crossing of Greenland's ice cap. It's celebrated as a scientific milestone. But there's a detail rarely discussed: his original plan. Nansen didn't intend to cross Greenland by just any route. His planned route aligned almost exactly with the location of the channel shown on older maps. That's not a small coincidence. He chose that corridor because on paper it looked like the logical choice, a natural depression, a geographic pathway. But on the ground, his team encountered conditions that made that route impossible, forcing them far south. The official story blames unstable ice and impassable terrain. But when you overlay Nansen's planned route with the maps that show the channel, the alignment is unsettling. It's as if he tried to follow a trace that no longer existed. Now, in the present, Greenland returns to headlines, not because of old maps, but because of accelerated melt. In a single day during a recent heat wave, Greenland lost around 12 billion tons of ice. Studies suggest the current loss rate is about 4 times higher than it was in the early 2000s. Every summer, the edge retreats. And as it does, new surfaces appear. Rock with unexpected shapes, alignments that don't entirely match a simple glacier erosion story, zones that raise more questions than answers. What's striking is how the dominant focus remains almost entirely on climate consequences, sea level rise, ecosystems, emissions, all real. But it avoids one uncomfortable question. What if the melt reveals something that doesn't fit the accepted history? If Greenland froze relatively recently, within the last 500 years, then many pieces suddenly lock into place. 15th and 16th century maps stop looking impossible. Descriptions of vegetation and internal passages stop looking like errors. The disappearance of Norse settlements matches an abrupt environmental shift rather than a slow decline. The so-called Little Ice Age, roughly spanning the 14th to the 19th centuries, is often described as a moderate cooling. But historical records speak of failed harvests, famines, extreme winters, and forced migrations. And if the Arctic experienced a far harsher version than commonly acknowledged, that's uncomfortable, because it forces us to reconsider time scales. It forces us to accept that massive geographic transformations can occur in centuries, not only in millennia. And that doesn't just affect Greenland. It changes how we understand planetary stability. If, under the ice, we find remnants of settlement, roads, structures, or even simple traces of human activity beyond the coasts, then the debate stops being theoretical, because we would have to explain how those things could exist on an island that, according to the dominant narrative, was frozen long before humans arrived. For now, most of Greenland is still covered, but the ice is no longer motionless, and every meter of retreat brings us closer to a moment when old maps stop being uncomfortable drawings and start acting like witnesses. If explorers, missionaries, and cartographers described a more habitable Greenland, and today the ice is pulling back too fast, then the question becomes simple. When exactly did this island truly freeze? And why does nobody talk about that? There's a point in every investigation when questions stop being abstract and become physical, tangible, irreversible. Greenland is approaching that point right now. For decades, the ice cap was presented as a constant, ancient, stable, almost eternal, a block of deep geological time that didn't need to be questioned. But today, that block is breaking, not only literally, but narratively. The science admits Greenland is losing ice rapidly. Satellites, ground stations, and direct measurements confirm it. In some recent events, daily melt reached numbers that would have sounded impossible just 20 years ago. Billions of tons disappearing in hours, not centuries, not millennia, days. But here's something curious. Even though we know how much ice is being lost, we rarely talk about what is being exposed. The focus stays almost entirely on future consequences. Sea level rise, global climate impact, risks to coastal cities, all real. But it sidesteps the question that could rewrite the story. What kind of landscape is emerging? Because if the ice is truly more than 1 million years old, the bed beneath it should show clear signs of long, uninterrupted pressure, extreme deformation, uniformly polished surfaces, consistent patterns of sustained load, and above all, the total absence of any human trace beyond the known coasts. Yet what little has already been exposed doesn't always match that expectation. Along the margins, researchers have documented surprisingly preserved surfaces, relief that doesn't look like it was crushed for hundreds of thousands of years, structures with defined geometry. The standard explanation calls these local exceptions, but the number of exceptions keeps growing, and that brings us back to the modern cartographic silence. The technology to map beneath ice exists. Ice-penetrating radar has been used for decades, especially in Antarctica. It has revealed subglacial lakes, buried mountain ranges, deep valleys under kilometers of ice. Those studies also exist for Greenland. The data has been collected, but when a normal person opens a digital map, they see none of it. No buried ridges, no valleys, no ancient channels, only a uniform blank. As if Greenland's interior is better left abstract until the ice decides to reveal it on its own. That is strange, because cartography has never worked like this. Historically, maps tried to show what was known, even when incomplete. Old Greenland maps did the opposite of hiding the interior. They filled it with information, mountains, names, routes, notes. In Tartaria research, that's the red flag. Older cartography is sometimes more detailed than the modern story wants to admit. Modern maps do the opposite. They empty it, and that emptiness shapes thought. If you can't see the terrain, you don't question it. If you don't question it, the dominant narrative faces no friction. The ice becomes not only a physical layer, but a conceptual layer that blocks deep historical revision. But ice doesn't negotiate with narratives. As it retreats, it forces answers to questions postponed for centuries. If Greenland froze relatively recently, where are the records of such a dramatic event? Why aren't there clear descriptions of a transition so extreme? The answer may be that they do exist, just not as modern scientific papers. They're scattered across chronicles, maps, sagas, travel accounts, documents that don't fit comfortably inside today's framework. The Little Ice Age was not gentle. In Europe, it left deep marks. Rivers frozen through entire winters, repeated crop failures, hunger, migrations, social collapse. If that cooling struck the far north harder than commonly admitted, Greenland would have been one of the first places to feel it in full. That would explain many things at once. It would explain why the Norse settlements vanish abruptly, not from slow decay, but from rapid environmental collapse. It would explain why maps shift from depicting a detailed land to depicting an increasingly white mass. It would explain why 17th century cartographers still referenced passages that were once navigable, as if memory of the old landscape hadn't fully died yet. And it would explain something even more unsettling. The absence of deep archaeology in Greenland's interior would not prove there was never anything there. It would simply mean it was buried too fast to be documented and too deeply to be excavated. Until now. If the ice continues to retreat, it won't be a matter of opinion. It will be direct observation. Either traces of human activity appear beyond the known coastlines, or they don't. Either the relief matches current models, or it resembles what old maps repeatedly showed. In either case, something changes. If nothing appears, the official timeline gains strength. But if anomalies appear, structures, alignments, modified terrain, then the question won't be whether the old maps were wrong. It will be why they were ignored for so long. Greenland is in the news today because of melting, but the deepest impact may not be climatic or economic. It may be historical, because once enough ice pulls back, It will no longer be possible to hold every version of the story at once. Some narratives will have to give way, and when that happens, the biggest discovery might not be what appears under the ice, but what we realize we should never have stopped looking for. And here's the reason this belongs in the same category as lost maps and vanished regions. A frozen interior is the perfect cover. It delays archaeology. It delays verification. It turns the center of a landmass into a locked archive. If Greenland's interior was more open within the last few centuries, if channels, routes, or habitable zones existed and then closed, then what you're watching isn't only climate change. You're watching history re-enter the world. And when that happens, the question won't be, was there a cover-up? The question will be, how many chapters of the recent past were rewritten simply because the evidence stayed buried long enough?